Okay. Hello, everyone. This is Colin Cox, and this is the Week 7 audio lecture for early American literature. Today, I want to discuss Phillis Wheatley, an important figure, a titan of not only American history, but American literature, and specifically a titan of African American history and African American literature. Phillis Wheatley, for example, and I'll say a bit about her biography. I don't often like to do this, but Wheatley's biography is fascinating, it's impressive, and she has the distinction of publishing the first book in English by a person of color. In 1773, she published poems on various subjects, religion and moral, and there was some controversy the year prior regarding the validity of the text, authorship, etc. I'll talk about that in just a moment. But Wheatley was a slave. She received education a bit later in her life, but by all accounts, she was remarkable. She was a genius. And I think we see this in the kind of poetry she wrote, the kinds of different forms, meter, rhyme, just the overall style of her poetry. It feels very neoclassical. It's this neoclassic aesthetic. But what's interesting about Wheatley is how she blends that older neoclassical aesthetic with, for her time, contemporary race and religious issues. And I'll say something now about this controversy. So there's no delicate way to say this, but quite frankly, no one believed a Black slave could have written these poems. So in 1772, 18 white men, they met, they convened, they interviewed Wheatley, and they in effect just assessed her and her work in an attempt to discover whether she actually wrote the book, whether she wrote those poems, or if she was just perhaps a political prop for abolition politics. And we don't have the transcript, if it ever existed, of that interview, but the following year, Wheatley published her book, and according to Henry Louis Gates Jr., who is an African American historian and scholar, this was an important moment because according to Gates, quote, if she had indeed, and this comes directly from his book on Wheatley, quote, if she had indeed written her poems, then this would demonstrate that Africans were human beings and should be liberated from slavery. So in that way, again, Wheatley is just this remarkably significant figure. She's such an enduring figure for those very reasons. Again, not only does she have the distinction of publishing the first book in English by a Black person, but this larger question surrounding the legitimacy of the authorship of that book, according to someone like Gates, it did this larger bit of political work of validating the abolitionist position. And according to someone like Gates, it inaugurated the publication of this book in 1773, inaugurated the African American literary tradition as we know and understand it. So, with that said, let's actually just transition to the poetry. And I think I want to start on 789 with On Being Brought from Africa to America. So I think I'll just start by reading the poem and then offering a bit of commentary. And again, I might place some of my analysis within the context of Gates's book on Wheatley. So again, this is on 789. 'Twas mercy brought me from my pagan land, taught my benighted soul to understand that there's a God, that there's a Savior too. Once I redemption neither sought nor knew. Some view our sable race with scornful eye. Their color is a diabolical dye. Remember, Christians, Negroes black as Cain may be refined and join the angelic train. So one of the more interesting things you'll notice is for a figure like Wheatley, Africa, it's not an idealized place. If anything, she was saved from Africa. And for a writer like Henry Louis Gates Jr., I mentioned him a moment ago. This is part of the reason why this line of argumentation, and I'll explain what I think she means, but this is part of the reason why she was so often overlooked for the longest time within the history and within the canon of African American literature. And that's because, according to Gates, and this is a quote directly from his book, Wheatley was not being black enough. And I think part of how he spoke about, or how he speaks about this poem in particular, is how you could potentially read this as a kind of justification for what ultimately happened to her. I remember I taught this poem in a class a couple of years ago, and I had students who said, "Listen, I understand exactly what Wheatley means, because for her, all of this is a way of exalting God and the Christian God, but it has this effect of, again, potentially justifying what happened to her. You could almost read it as the ends justify the means. And again, for a figure like Gates, placing Wheatley within a particular sort of context and recognizing and acknowledging how important faith was to her, and I'll talk about this more with one of the letters that I asked you to read, it helps to explain, and perhaps even in this way, you might read someone like Wheatley and hear a bit of a figure like Mary Rawlinson, who would perhaps argue, or who suggested in the narrative I asked you to read earlier this semester, that this was all part of a larger plan. For someone like Wheatley, the specifics of what she experienced was all part of a larger plan. And again, I would just encourage you to consider what you think about that. And another way that perhaps you could see a similarity between a figure like Wheatley and someone like Rawlinson, who we read earlier, you'll notice in line 2, she introduces this wretched sinner narrative. And this is a narrative, again, that's quite popular, especially if you read literature from this time. And it's pivoting from this notion that God, and in particular the Christian God, or specifically the Christian God, offers salvation to a collection of individuals, or a group of people who would otherwise be undeserving of such salvation. But perhaps part of how Wheatley, and again, I'm using a figure like Mary Rawlinson as a kind of compare and contrast, I think one of the ways that you can actually see Wheatley departing from someone like Rawlinson is when she introduces this notion of reformation, because I think that's important. Because for someone like Wheatley, it suggests, and again, this seems so self-evident to us today, but I think it's important to acknowledge that this wasn't self-evident in the 18th century, at the end of the 18th century, but it seems to suggest that African Americans are in fact human, and that reformation is possible for them in the same way that it is for anyone and everyone. And it has this effect of elevating people of color, black people, slaves, and former slaves to this kind of existential place that's similar to white Americans, white slave holders. Again, it's this line of interpretation, or this way of reasoning that doesn't create the sorts of hierarchies that we saw with a figure like Jefferson, but it really does the work of introducing and even justifying racial equality and just equality among all human beings. And what's interesting is how Wheatley ultimately gets there, because for someone like Wheatley, this is all through God and Christianity. And something else that I think is interesting with a figure like Wheatley is how God ultimately works as this kind of unifying figure. And this is in many ways in contrast to a figure like Mary Rawlinson, who uses religion as a way of suggesting difference and exclusivity. This is one of the ways that Wheatley blends race and religion. Again, for someone like Wheatley, God and Christianity, it actually has this inclusive effect where it doesn't actually have or there aren't necessarily winners and losers. There's not the elect and then everyone else. For someone like Wheatley, God and Christianity, it's all deeply inclusive. And again, I think that's a way that while she is similar to a figure like Rawlinson, I think this is one of the ways that we can actually see how different she is from a figure like Rawlinson. Something else that I always like to mention as well is this reference to dye, and this is around, I believe this is the maybe seventh line of the poem. The color is a diabolical dye. And you can tell me if you agree with me or not here, but this word dye I think is quite interesting because dyes are synthetic. They're not actually natural. So I wonder if perhaps this is Wheatley or this is a way of perhaps reading race not as something that's natural and naturally occurring, but it's something that's made, it's something that's constructed, it's something that society actually constructs these kinds of divisions. Anyway, it's just a potential reading of this word die that I at least wanted to mention. But again, the final thing that I think I'll say is you can certainly see how, especially in the late 18th century, for a black person to write what she's writing, it would seem incredibly progressive. You can see how the abolitionist movement would want to adopt and use a figure like Wheatley to develop some of the larger points they want to develop and to make some of the larger points they want to make about the necessity of abolition. But you can also see, I think you can get a sense in particular, if you think about the mid 20th century and the civil rights movement, how this poem is not the kind of poem you need to offer this kind of context to understand exactly what Wheatley means. And for that reason, again, I think this helps to explain, at least for a scholar like Henry Louis Gates Jr., and I'm inclined to agree with him, this certainly helps to explain why Wheatley was so often overlooked. And I think part of it as well is just how this poem sounds, the meter and the rhyme, just the overall style of the poem. This is something that feels a bit older. It's a bit antiquated. And again, this reveals more than anything Wheatley's influences, but she's also deriving influence from an unmistakably white Anglo tradition. And so much of the civil rights movement, at least some aspects of the civil rights movement, was about creating art, literature, poetry, music that was a departure from these kinds of white Anglo influences. So again, in that way, you can see why for so many people in the abolitionist movement in the 18th and 19th century, because again, it wasn't long until a figure like Frederick Douglass became the face of abolition, the black face of abolition in this country and in many ways across the world. But again, my larger point is you certainly get the sense, or you can see why someone like Wheatley was perhaps often marginalized, shunted aside, ignored, etc. But I think now I want to speak about this short letter she wrote in 1774 to Reverend Samson Occam. And this begins on page 798. And again, this is an incredibly short letter. So I think, like the poem I just read, I'll read the letter in its entirety. But I want you to keep in mind what I just said about how for a figure like Henry Louis Gates Jr., perhaps part of his reasoning or his interpretation for why Wheatley was so often ignored, it's because, again, according to Gates, quote, she was not being black enough, or she seemed to lack something. But I think what you ultimately see here is a challenge to what even I just said a moment ago about how, well, to really understand Wheatley's racial politics, you need to place her in a particular sort of context. I think this letter actually does the work of challenging everything that I just said. So I want to read this letter. It begins on 798. Follow along with me. Reverend and honored sir, I have this day received your obliging king epistle, and am greatly satisfied with your reasons respecting the Negroes, and think highly reasonable what you offer in vindication of their natural rights. Those that invade them cannot be insensible that the divine light is chasing away the thick darkness which broods over the land of Africa, and the chaos which has reigned so long is converting into beautiful order, and reveals more and more clearly the glorious dispensation of civil and religious liberty, which are so inseparably united that there is little or no enjoyment of one without the other. Otherwise, perhaps the Israelites had been less solicitous for their freedom from Egyptian slavery. I do not say they would have been contented without it. By no means, for in every human breast God has implanted a principle which we call love of freedom. It is impatient of oppression and pants for deliverance. And by the leave of our modern Egyptians, I will assert that the same principle lives in us. God grant deliverance in his own way and time, and get him honor upon all those whose avarice impels them to countenance and help forward the calamities of their fellow creatures. This I desire not for their hurt, but to convince them of the strange absurdity of their conduct, whose words and actions are so diametrically opposite. How well the cry for liberty and the reverse disposition for the exercise of oppressive power over others agree. I humbly think it does not require the penetration of a philosopher to determine. So, Wheatley said a lot of things here, and I think where I want to start is with this notion that in every human breast, God has implanted a principle which we call love of freedom. And so she's saying something here that is perhaps an interesting challenge to a figure like Jefferson. This is something I haven't mentioned before, but for someone like Henry Louis Gates Jr., his book is really quite interesting because he, throughout the book, effectively contrasts a figure like Wheatley and places her in conversation with someone like Jefferson. And I think what's interesting here is, again, if you remember back to what we read of Jefferson perhaps last week, he makes these clear distinctions, and he's using, again, natural science as he understood it to understand these obvious differences and distinctions between white and black people. But notice Wheatley's challenge here. Her challenge is actually, no. There are these natural rights, and they're for freedom. This is according to Wheatley what all human beings share, regardless of their race, their color, etc. This is something, and you'll notice again this combination or this blending of race and religion, because for Wheatley, it's not something that human beings just have independent of the divine. For someone like Wheatley, it's the divine that imparts these feelings to all human beings. This is perhaps the one thing for someone like Wheatley that ties or tethers us together. It's this natural inclination and this natural desire for freedom. And she even, again, I think this letter in particular, I don't know how much contextualizing you need to do to really understand how Wheatley feels about this. Again, this I desire not for their hurt, but to convince them of the strange absurdity of their conduct, whose words and actions are so diametrically opposite. Again, she's not necessarily mincing words here. And she even says at the end of the letter, I humbly think it does not require the penetration of a philosopher to determine. This is so funny. But more importantly, this scathing critique of anyone who would hold or espouse this anti-abolitionist perspective, or I think for someone like Wheatley, anyone who would do perhaps what a figure like Jefferson does in Notes on the State of Virginia, where he attempts to understand how nature has created these clear and unambiguous hierarchies. For someone like Wheatley, I think her response is, well, that's just complete and utter nonsense, and you don't even need to be a philosopher to understand that. So again, you can see she doesn't mention or she doesn't reference Thomas Jefferson, but you could see how this is perhaps akin to like subtweeting him, right? She's clearly, if she's not explicitly referencing Jefferson, she's referencing the sorts of ideas that Jefferson embodies in a text like Notes on the State of Virginia. But and we talked about this last week, how Jefferson, what he wrote in Notes on the State of Virginia about race, and again, how he used natural science as a way of justifying these hierarchies. This was not exclusive to Jefferson. This was very much in the air at the time. And I just used Jefferson as a kind of symbol or a kind of metaphor for that whole way of thinking in the late 18th and well into the 19th century. But again, I think what's interesting about this letter, especially when we place it within a kind of context, within even when we contextualize it with Wheatley's work, such as, or for example, with a poem like On Being Brought from Africa to America, it does beg or introduce this question, or at least it provokes me into thinking, well, perhaps one of the reasons why Wheatley was so often ignored and marginalized was because people just didn't take her, or people didn't read her in her totality, because I think the anthology does a really nice job here, especially if you think about the trajectory of how, if you read all of Phillis Wheatley from this anthology, how we start with a poem like On Being Brought from Africa, On Being Brought from Africa to America, and how you really need to do a lot of explaining to contextualize what she means, and how she's not, again, offering a kind of justification for the awful things that happen to her. But again, if you just look at the trajectory here, how we move from a poem that might require a bit of contextualizing to a letter that I don't think requires really any contextualizing whatsoever. You could imagine, for example, a civil rights leader in the mid 20th century quoting someone like Wheatley saying, I think just like Phillis Wheatley that, this doesn't require the penetration of a philosopher to determine. It's that self-evident. So Henry Louis Gates Jr., I've mentioned him a couple of times in today's lecture. In his book on Wheatley, I think his take is ultimately Wheatley, she was oversimplified by future generations, by posterity. She was not placed in a proper context, or the proper context. And maybe most importantly, she just wasn't read thoroughly and closely, because I think if you read her, even again, we're not reading everything Wheatley wrote or everything Wheatley published. We're only reading a small section. But I think if you're just paying attention, her position on race and racial inequality, her position on abolition, it's quite clear. But again, I think for some, and many of my students have expressed such trepidation, the way she wants to blend religion and race, for many of my students, is a problem. And it might not be a problem for you. In fact, I think it's quite interesting how she's able to connect all of these different issues and concerns and preoccupations. And I think it's also worth mentioning as well, throughout the history of American literature and American rhetoric, the Bible, regrettably, and Christianity, regrettably, was often used and deployed as a weapon to justify slavery. So I think for someone like Wheatley, using Christianity using the Bible and using religion to in fact combat and antagonize some of those ideas is something of a refreshing alternative to how the Bible was so often used during this time and in the 19th century, and even in some cases early in the 20th century, to justify and to rationalize forms of oppression, and specifically racial oppression between white and black people. Okay, I think that's all I want to say for today. Again, Phyllis Wheatley, she's one of my favorites. I so thoroughly enjoy teaching her and talking about her. She was a fascinating person. She writes just beautiful poetry. And if you are curious about her and interested, I would encourage you just to find her poetry. It's all in the public domain, I believe. I would want to double check and see. But yeah, Phyllis Wheatley, she's quite a spectacular poet, person, and figure. So I'll just stop gushing now. But listen, until we talk next time, this is Colin Cox for Early American Literature. I hope you all have a wonderful day.